The morning of June 23, 1942, started like any other at Pembrey airfield in South Wales. Royal Air Force spotters stood at their posts, scanning the grey coastal sky through binoculars, watching for threats that could appear at any moment. Then something cut through the cloud cover, something that made their hearts stop. A German fighter, sleek and deadly, was dropping altitude, lining itself up with their runway. The shape was unmistakable. The silhouette burned into every Allied pilot's memory through briefings and survival films. A Focke-Wulf 190, the enemy. But here's what didn't make sense. No air raid sirens were howling across the base. No anti-aircraft batteries were swinging their barrels toward the sky. Because something about the way this pilot was flying, the way he was banking into his approach, felt wrong. It wasn't the dive of an attacker. It was the careful descent of a pilot coming home. The landing gear dropped. The flaps extended, and then, smooth as silk, the FW-190 touched down on British grass, rolling to a gentle stop near the control tower like it had been scheduled all along. The engine died. The propeller blades slowed and stopped. The canopy slid back with a metallic scrape, and out climbed Oberleutnant Armin Faber of Jagdgeschwader II, one of Germany's elite fighter wings. He pulled off his leather flying helmet, ran a hand through his sweat-dampened hair, and looked around at the buildings surrounding him. Then the color drained from his face. The aircraft parked along the flight line weren't the uniforms, sprinting toward him from every direction, weren't Luftwaffe gray. They were Royal Air Force blue. And in that single, horrifying heartbeat, Armin Faber realized what he'd done. He hadn't landed at a German airfield in occupied France. He'd just delivered Germany's most lethal, most secretive fighter aircraft directly into the hands of the British. Intact, undamaged, ready to be torn apart and studied. The intelligence officers who received the call minutes later could barely believe what they were hearing. For 8 brutal months, the Focke-Wulf 190 had been an absolute nightmare for Allied pilots. It had appeared without warning over France in September of 1941. And from the very first engagement, every pilot who survived an encounter knew they'd faced something terrifying. Royal Air Force Squadron Leader J.E. Johnson, a man who would go on to become Britain's highest-scoring ace, barely made it out of his first fight with an FW-190 in early 1942. Years later, he'd write about it with the kind of cold honesty that only comes from surviving the impossible. It was faster than our Spitfire Mark Fives in level flight and in the dive. It could outroll us with almost no effort. Its firepower was devastating. For the first time since the war began, our fighters were completely outclassed. The numbers told the story in blood. In the first 6 months of 1942, RAF fighter losses over France climbed at a terrifying rate. Pilots who'd survived the Battle of Britain, men with experience and skill and luck on their side, were being shot out of the sky by an aircraft they couldn't match. The FW-190 could dive away from Spitfires that tried to chase it. It could snap roll through defensive maneuvers faster than Allied pilots could react. And it could shred aircraft with 20mm cannons that fired explosive shells, tearing through aluminum and flesh like paper. When American pilots started arriving in Britain with their P-47 Thunderbolts, the warnings came immediately. Don't engage the 190 in turning combat. Don't try to outroll it. Don't chase it into a dive. The list of what not to do stretched on and on. The list of what actually worked, what might keep you alive, was terrifyingly short. British intelligence was desperate. They needed answers. What made this fighter so deadly? What were its weaknesses? How could Allied pilots fight it and survive? But getting those answers meant examining an actual FW-190, and every one that had been shot down over Britain was too mangled, too burned, too destroyed to reveal anything useful. Until Armin Faber made his catastrophic mistake. Now, Faber wasn't some rookie fresh out of flight school. At just 21 years old, he'd already racked up multiple kills and earned his place in Jagdgeschwader II, one of the Luftwaffe's most elite units. On June 23rd, he'd been flying top cover for German bombers hitting targets along the English coast. The mission had gone smoothly. The bombs fell. The fighters engaged. Everything by the book. But on the return flight, somewhere over the cold waters of the English Channel, something went wrong. Faber was in the middle of aggressive maneuvering, twisting and rolling through a dogfight with British fighters, pulling G's that pressed him into his seat and drained blood from his brain. Cloud cover swallowed the coastline. The sun gave him false directional cues. And when he finally broke through the clouds and saw green countryside stretching below, an airfield sitting in the distance, his mind made a simple, logical, utterly catastrophic assumption. He thought he was looking at France. He thought he was looking at home. He was actually staring at Wales, at RAF Pembrey, at the heart of enemy territory. The mistake seems impossible now, sitting in the comfort of hindsight. But combat disorientation was far more common than any military wanted to admit. Pilots flying at insane speeds through clouds, pulling high-G turns that starved their brains of oxygen. Sometimes they just lost track of where they were. Faber had executed a 180-degree turn during the dogfight. He simply didn't realize it. When his wheels touched British grass and he saw those Spitfires, Faber tried desperately to restart his engine, to get airborne again, to escape. But RAF personnel were already swarming the aircraft. Within minutes, he was surrounded. Within an hour, he was in custody, and British intelligence officers were standing next to a pristine, untouched, fully operational Focke-Wulf 190A, sitting on their runway like a gift from the gods. The reaction at RAF headquarters bordered on disbelief. Air Chief Marshal Sholto Douglas, commanding RAF Fighter Command, immediately ordered the aircraft transported to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. Every rivet was to be documented, every system measured, every advantage understood. Within 48 hours, the FW-190 was at Farnborough, surrounded by Britain's top aviation engineers, all of them staring at the machine that had been killing their pilots for months. What they discovered explained everything. The aircraft was a masterpiece, but not in the way the Spitfire was a masterpiece. The Spitfire represented elegant aerodynamic beauty. The FW-190 embodied brutal, ruthless functionality. Its BMW 801 radial engine churned out 1,700 horsepower compared to the Spitfire Mark Fives 1,470. But raw power wasn't the whole story, wasn't even the main story. The FW-190's most devastating advantage was something most people wouldn't even think about. Its roll rate. The aircraft could snap from one bank to the other faster than any Allied fighter in the sky. And that seemingly small detail was absolutely revolutionary in combat. When a Spitfire tried to follow an FW-190 through rolling maneuvers, it couldn't keep up. The German pilot could reverse direction, gain angles, and line up a killing shot before the British pilot could even react. British test pilot Captain Eric Brown flew the captured FW-190 extensively, and the moment he did, he understood why so many Allied pilots had died. The ailerons were light and responsive at all speeds. You could throw this aircraft around the sky with almost no effort. The Spitfire required muscle and finesse. The FW-190 responded to thought the firepower advantage was just as brutal. The FW-190A3 variant carried for 20mm MG-151 cannons and two 7.92mm machine guns. A 2-second burst delivered more explosive destruction than a Spitfire Mark 5 could generate in 10 full seconds of sustained fire, and the weapons were mounted in the wings close to the fuselage, creating a tight, concentrated pattern of death that was absolutely devastating at combat ranges. The dive performance explained how FW-190s consistently escaped pursuing The German fighter's heavier weight and cleaner aerodynamics meant it could outdive anything the RAF had in service. British pilots who tried to follow an FW-190 into a steep dive watched helplessly as the enemy aircraft pulled away, disappearing into the distance while they maxed out their own machines trying to keep up. But the testing also revealed something crucial, something that would change everything: weaknesses. The FW-190 wasn't invincible. The radial engine, while powerful down low, created serious cooling problems at high altitude. Above 20,000 feet, the aircraft's performance fell off a cliff. The engine struggled in thin air. Pilots reported power loss and overheating. Meanwhile, the Spitfire's Merlin engine, specifically designed for high-altitude operation, actually performed better as altitude increased. The heavy weight that made the FW-190 a superior dive bomber also made it less maneuverable in sustained turning combat. The aircraft could outroll a Spitfire all day long, but it couldn't outturn one in a prolonged, grinding horizontal fight. If an Allied pilot could force an FW-190 into a sustained turn, the advantage shifted. Most critically, American engineers discovered that the FW-190's controls became extremely heavy at high speeds. In a dive exceeding 400 miles per hour, the pilot needed significant physical strength just to pull out. And that created a vulnerable moment, a window of opportunity. If an Allied fighter could stay with an FW-1090 through the initial dive and catch it during the pullout, when the German pilot was literally wrestling his own controls, attacks became feasible. British intelligence immediately started distributing tactical bulletins to RAF squadrons across England. But they also did something that would prove absolutely crucial for how the air war would unfold. They invited American test pilots to Pembrey. Come see Germany's secret weapon. Come fly it. Come learn how to kill it. In August 1942, U.S. Army Air Forces pilots arrived at Farnborough to examine the aircraft that had been slaughtering Allied fighters for almost a year. These pilots would return to American training bases with knowledge that would save hundreds, maybe thousands, of American lives. Major Cass Hawk was one of the first Americans to strap into the captured FW-190. His report was blunt, tactical, and brutally honest. He didn't sugarcoat anything. The FW-190 will beat any Allied fighter below 20,000 feet if the German pilot knows what he's doing. Our advantage is altitude. Above 25,000 feet, our P-47s and later model Spitfires have the edge. Force them high, and we win. Let them dictate low-altitude combat, and we die. That single piece of intelligence, that one clear tactical directive, fundamentally changed American fighter doctrine in Europe. When P-47 Thunderbolt units began operations in 1943, their entire approach emphasized high-altitude combat. Bomber escorts flew at maximum altitude. Fighter sweeps operated above 25,000 feet whenever possible. When German fighters tried to engage, American pilots would climb, forcing the FW-190s to follow them into the thin air, where their engines choked and gasped. The captured FW-190 also influenced American aircraft development in ways that would ripple through the war. Engineers at Wright Field studied the incredible roll rate and began modifying P-47 and P-51 ailerons to improve responsiveness. The FW-190's gun placement informed American thinking about weapons concentration and firing patterns. Even the cockpit layout, which German designers had ruthlessly optimized for combat efficiency, influenced how American fighters were designed and equipped. But perhaps the most important lesson wasn't technical, it was psychological. Allied pilots had been intimidated by the FW-190's reputation, by the mystique of this invincible German superweapon. Now they had concrete information about how to fight it and win. The monster had weaknesses. The nightmare could be killed. By late 1943, the tactical situation in the skies over Europe had shifted dramatically. American P-47s and P-51 Mustangs were engaging FW-190s at high altitude, where Allied fighters held the clear advantage. RAF Spitfire Mark Fives, equipped with upgraded Merlin engines, could match the FW-190's performance across most altitude ranges. And pilots on both sides understood they were flying different aircraft optimized for different conditions. The kill ratios began shifting in the Allies' favor. FW-190 losses climbed steadily as American and British pilots exploited every weakness that Faber's captured aircraft had revealed. German pilots started noticing that Allied fighters were no longer making the tactical mistakes that had given the FW-190 its early dominance. Oberleutnant Joseph Pips Priller, a high-scoring FW-190 ace, commented in late 1943 that American pilots had clearly studied the aircraft thoroughly. They know not to follow us into rolling scissors anymore. They force us high where our engines labor. They've learned. The captured FW-190 remained at Farnborough throughout the entire war, serving as a reference aircraft for evaluating new German variants as they appeared in combat. And the FW-190D9, the Dora, with its inline engine, showed up in late 1944. Allied intelligence immediately compared it to Faber's original capture. Understanding exactly how German designers had addressed the high-altitude limitations, after the war ended, aviation historians started calculating the actual impact of Faber's catastrophic navigation error. The intelligence gained from that single intact aircraft was shared with thousands of Allied pilots through tactical bulletins, training films, and direct demonstration flights at bases across England and America. The knowledge influenced aircraft development programs, tactical doctrine at every level, and operational planning across multiple air forces. Captain Eric Brown, the British test pilot who flew more captured enemy aircraft than any other Allied pilot during the war, would later write something that captured the magnitude of what had happened. Faber's navigation error gave us the Rosetta Stone for understanding German fighter design. Every tactical advantage the FW-190 possessed was documented in detail. Every weakness was identified and exploited. That single aircraft probably saved more Allied lives than any intelligence operation of the entire war. The irony wasn't lost on German intelligence when they finally learned what had happened. One Luftwaffe officer commented bitterly, "We spent months desperately trying to capture an intact Spitfire Mark 9 so we could study its improvements and understand what we were facing. The British didn't have to try. We delivered our best fighter directly to their doorstep." Armin Faber spent the rest of the war in a prisoner of war camp in Canada, far from the skies he'd once dominated. He survived, returned to Germany after the war ended, and lived until 1976. Luftwaffe records suggest he was initially blamed for the loss of the aircraft, that his career and reputation were destroyed by that single mistake. But later assessments acknowledged something uncomfortable, something honest. Combat disorientation could happen to any pilot, no matter how skilled, no matter how experienced. The real question, the one that haunted German intelligence for years, was why they'd assumed the British would never get their hands on an intact FW-190. Why they'd believed their technological advantage was permanent. The story of Faber's captured fighter teaches something crucial about the nature of technological advantage in modern warfare. Germany's Focke-Wulf 190 represented a genuine quantum leap in fighter design when it first appeared in 1941. For nearly a year, it dominated every Allied aircraft through superior performance and innovative engineering that seemed years ahead of anything Britain or America could field. But that advantage evaporated the moment Allied engineers could examine the actual machine, could measure its performance, could understand its compromises. Because no aircraft is truly invincible, every design involves trade-offs and sacrifices. The FW-190's low-altitude dominance came at the cost of high-altitude performance. Its excellent roll rate came with heavy, difficult controls at high speeds. Its powerful armament added weight that reduced overall maneuverability. Once Allied pilots understood these trade-offs, once they knew where the weaknesses lived, they could exploit them ruthlessly. Today, the Focke-Wulf 190 is remembered as one of World War II's truly great fighter designs. Aviation museums display surviving examples as masterpieces of German engineering and wartime innovation. Enthusiasts study its design philosophy. Historians debate its impact, but the aircraft's reputation is forever inseparable from the intelligence coup that revealed all its secrets to the enemy. In the complex, brutal calculus of wartime advantage, one pilot's momentary disorientation over the cold waters of the English Channel turned Germany's most guarded secret weapon into an open book. The FW-190 that Armin Faber accidentally delivered to Britain became the aircraft that taught an entire generation of Allied pilots how to win. The lesson echoes through military history, whispers through every conflict that followed. Superior technology matters. Superior intelligence matters more. And sometimes the greatest victories don't come from devastating attacks or brilliant strategies, but from simple human mistakes that hand your enemy exactly what they've been desperately, frantically seeking. The Focke-Wulf 190 could have remained a mystery, an invincible opponent that continued killing Allied pilots through psychological terror as much as technical superiority. Instead, it became a teaching tool that every Allied pilot studied, learned from, and ultimately defeated. One navigation error, one landed aircraft. It's one intelligence windfall that changed the air war over Europe forever. That's how the Allies got Germany's secret fighter. And that's how a single mistake made in a moment of confusion over the English Channel shifted the balance of power in the skies and helped win the war.